Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Farley, and I am one of JRSA's associates, research associates. For those of you who are less familiar with JRSA, it stands for Justice Research and Statistics Association. We are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to the use of research and analysis to inform criminal and juvenile justice decision-making, and we are comprised of a network of researchers and practitioners, which at the core include directors and staff from state statistical analysis centers. So it is my pleasure today to welcome you to our webinar, Protecting Human Subjects and IRBs, an overview. It will be presented by a number of individuals from the University of Southern Maine. I have my little cheat sheet here, and that includes Ross Hickey, who is an assistant provost for the research integrity at the University of Southern Maine. Then we also have Casey Webster, who is the research compliance administrator at the university. And then we also have George Shaler, who is the Maine Statistical Analysis Center director. So welcome, everybody. And before I go any further, I want to thank our partners at the Bureau of Justice Statistics for helping to make this webinar possible. I would also like to cover a few logistical items. We will be recording today's session for future playback, and the link to the recording will be posted on the JRSA website, and it's usually done the following day. So if you're interested and have staff who would like to view this webinar, it should be available tomorrow. Today's webinar is being audiocast via both the speakers on your computer and teleconference, and we recommend listening to the webinar using your computer speakers or headphones. To access the audio conference, select Audio from the top menu bar, and then select Audio Conference. Once the audio conference window appears, you can view the teleconference call-in information or join the audio conference via your computer. If you have any technical difficulties or get disconnected during the session, you can reconnect to the session using the same link you used to join. You can also email Jason Trask at jtrask@jrsa.org. Okay, we have everybody who is coming into this webinar. You guys are on mute, and you are allowed to submit questions to the presenter. What we would like, though, is, if you have anything that is pressing, you are welcome to put that in the chat menu. We would like to reserve the answering for any questions until the very end of the webinar. However, if you do have a question, what we would like you to do is to submit the question to the host, the presenter, and the panelists. So if you see on this slide right here, go all the way down and you can see host, presenter, and panelists, or all participants. And that way everybody can see the question. Okay, this session is supposed to go for about 1 hour. And let's see, okay, so what we are doing now is we are trying to get a better count of all the people who are watching our webinars. So if you are viewing as a group, what we would love for you to do is to take a second to actually use that chat window and type in the name of the person that's registered and the total number of additional people in the room. This will really help us keep track of the number of people who attend our webinars. So if you have a second to just do that, we will keep track of that. We also do, at the very last end of the webinar, we do have a few polling questions that we would like you to answer. This, again, helps us to plan and improve future webinars, and it helps us meet our reporting requirements. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to George. So welcome, George and colleagues. And I just pulled that little magic ball to your name, so you should have control of the slides. So it's all up to you now.
Thank you, Erin, and we can see that. Hi, folks. This is George Shaler. I'm the Maine Statistical Analysis Center Director. My SAC is based at a university. We're one of 7 SACs that are based at a university, and I am on staff here at the University of Southern Maine as well. I'm also, just to let you know, the vice chair of the USM IRB, and that's one of the reasons why I've become very interested in this issue, and I roped in my colleagues here, Ross Hickey and Casey Webster, into this presentation. They're going to give you a far more detail about IRB issues than I can, but I'm going to turn it over right now to Ross, who is, as Aaron said, the director of our Office of Research Integrity and Outreach here at the University of Southern Maine. So we'll get started.
Thanks, George. So we're going to break this into chunks. You're going to hear from all of us. Where I'm going to come in first is to give you the broad overview of some of the fundamental questions that you will be answering, we hopefully will answer when looking at institutional review boards and human subjects. So I'm going to walk you through what some of the basic definitions are that guide whether or not your project needs to go through an IRB. For example, we'll look at the definitions of what is research under the federal regulations, what is a human subject, what is an IRB, what are the areas that are outside of the IRB's purview, and why these regulations were created in the first place. So the first slide I will take you to is the question of what is research. Now, this definition is not one that you're necessarily going to see aligning with your area or discipline, but it is the one that the feds look at and the one that drives whether or not an institutional review board, which we'll talk about in a little bit what an IRB or institutional review board is, whether or not it's going to look at your project. This definition has been the bane of many researchers' existence because it uses terms that should be defined in and of themselves. The feds saw fit not to do that, but there are three essential elements that you should keep in mind when looking at this definition. That the project involves a systematic investigation, that there is a design involved that intends to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So the three elements are systematic investigation, that there's a design or an intent to develop, and finally, that there is generalizable knowledge that comes out of that research. Systematic investigation is fairly straightforward, that you're comparing and contrasting between different areas of data or different information that you have. That there's an intentionality to create research is pretty straightforward. It's that final part that many people struggle with, which is it generalizable? And what they mean by generalizability here is not necessarily the same as they would with statistical analysis. It is that you can draw broader conclusions from the specific area you're looking at, that whatever the data is you've collected, that it's not unique to your specific area that you're looking at, but so that you can draw from that broader conclusions to other like or similar situated locations or populations. That's not an official definition, but that's just through experience which most IRBs come to and that they probably will define in their policies. So once you ask the question of whether or not the project involves research, the second fundamental definition that will drive whether or not it goes to an IRB is whether or not it involves human subjects. Again, this is not a definition that is intuitive. It's created in federal regulations, and that usually means that intuitive is not a word you'll be using. When you look at this definition, the key areas that you need to remember are that it involves a living individual, okay? Now, there are some regulations such as this HIPAA that may involve deceased individuals' data that can be protected, but for the purposes of the common rule, which is the regulation that drives human subject research and IRBs, the subject needs to be living at the time that the information is collected. It also needs to be about the person. So if you ask an individual information about a industry they're in or an institution or something that is not about them or personal information about them, then it probably is not human subject research. It could very well be research, but it's important that both of these definitions have to go together. So you can have research, but if it doesn't involve human subjects, then it cannot or should not go to an institutional review board. So if you have a living individual and you're collecting information about them, you can do that in two ways. You can gather that information through an intervention or an interaction, which means either you're collecting samples or from that individual, or you're collecting information from them, say, through a focus group or a interview or a survey. It can even be an online survey. It can even be an anonymous survey. But under the federal regulations, that would be considered an interaction. So you either have an intervention or an interaction that provides information about an individual. The other way that you can involve human subjects is by collecting identifiable private information. So to contrast that with A, you very well can collect information that you have never met that person. You never interact with them. There's no intervention. But if you have access to information about them that's private and that is identifiable, you have involved them in your research, even though you've never met them. And an obvious example would be that if you were working with a healthcare provider and you had access to someone's medical records, or for the field that many of you are working in, if there was a way that you could identify information about a person that was not publicly available, that is private, that you would feel that they would have an expectation that before that information would be used, they would provide their consent. And we will talk about consent later on in the presentation. There is, right now, a major conversation going on nationally about the regulations that are in place to protect human subjects. I refer to it as the common rule. The reason it's called the common rule is because multiple federal agencies have all voluntarily agreed to join and create standard uniform regulations in place to protect human subjects. The last time that these regulations were revised or updated was in 1990, so it has been a long time, and there has been a considerable push to revise these regulations with all of the changes that have occurred in research in the United States. There is currently a new revised common rule that has been promulgated and adopted. The question now is whether it will stay on the books or whether it will be removed by the new administration. No one can really tell you that today. If there is a decision to keep this on the books and to keep the proposed changes that were adopted, literally I think within the last day or two of the Obama administration, there will be fundamental changes to many of the definitions, including human subject. And I'm sharing with you very quickly that that would change the definition I just shared with you in certain ways. Most particularly, even though it still involves a living individual and it's still about information about that person, the information can be collected, or information that can be collected through a biospecimen is also now a way that a person can be considered a human subject. So it broadens that, in that regard, the way that you can collect data, even if you've never met that individual, and have it fit under the definition of a human subject. So let's go to what an IRB is. An IRB is again defined under the common rule. It is an independent committee that is reviewing the project that you're proposing to make sure that it protects the rights and welfare of the human subjects involved. It is making sure that they are treated under the basic standards of that the common rule promulgates, also other additional foundational documents that drive this process, such as the Belmont report, which you may hear about in a little bit. This is not an ethical review board. This is something that often comes up when looking at IRBs, that people say, well, this is the ethics committee. Not necessarily. The IRB has a very defined role under the federal regulations, and as we've seen, if you're not involving human subject research, your project is probably not going to go through an IRB. When you look at what an IRB is composed of in general, it has certain requirements. It has to have at least 5 members. it has to have both a scientist and a non-scientist on board. For our university, which is an example, we need to have a member that is not otherwise affiliated with the university, so that we have that community member who provides a perspective on what we're doing. So when you look at an IRB, wherever you're at, if it is a federally registered IRB, meaning that it's an IRB that can review funded research, it has to have certain characteristics such as what you see on the screen and what I'm describing. Those things must be in place for you to get your federal-wide, your IRB registration and obtain a federal-wide assurance number, which allows you to do federally funded research. That's how institutions, even when they're at a local level, will come under these federal regulations because they want to obtain the federal funding. Now, there is a lot of flexibility the way the Common Rule sets this up. You don't have to create your own institutional review board at your site. You can have another IRB located somewhere else review your project. You'll see that people do this through a variety of ways. They can have a for-profit IRB that they pay to review. They can also have, which is something we have here, a collaborative IRB where multiple agencies come together and pool their resources and pool their researchers together to create a shared IRB, which is perfectly fine. If you have a multi-site study that involves multiple places that will be working on a project, one IRB can be the IRB of record and review that project on behalf of other institutions. There are many ways that you can be in compliance with the Common Rule. There's a lot of flexibility under the regulations, and even with the proposed changes, that will increase. In fact, it will be mandated that you'll see more one review by one IRB of record instead of multiple reviews by multiple IRBs. Again, there is flexibility here with the system. If the project that you are working on is not funded by or it's funded by a non-common rule agency, or it might be industry-sponsored research that does not involve a new drug or biologic or medical device, or it involves another country, doing research in another country, and it doesn't involve funding through a common rule agency, you do not necessarily have to go through an institutional review board. There are things that are outside the purview of an IRB unless, and this is very important, the institution you're at has created a policy that says even if it's not funded by a common rule agency, we will require review. Now, with any type of biologic, medical device, or experimental drug, you will still have to go through FDA review. There is still that additional requirement. You also will consider going through an IRB even if, strictly speaking, your funding doesn't require it, because it's a requirement of a journal that you want to publish in. You'll see that many times journals will require that before you're allowed to publish. What happens at many institutions and locations as you get into mission creep, you'll find that IRBs are given oversight over things that they technically are not, do not have overview over under the common rule. That's fine as long as that's in the policy of your institution. But if it is not, you want to be careful because you do not want to dilute the important mission that your institutional review board has. So as I talked about earlier, it's fine for your IRB to also be an ethical review committee for your institution, but you want that to be very clearly delineated in your policies, because when you start to do things that are beyond the common rule and beyond what the regulations say the mission is an IRB, you're going to have pushback from your researchers. We have these IRBs for a variety of reasons. There are a lot of historical atrocities that have occurred throughout time. Relatively recently, though, the IRB and the human subject protection laws came into place. But you will know from your own research and background that there are many places that caused the United States to create the protections we have, such as the Nazi doctors and the work that they did that was brought up in the Nuremberg trials, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the untreated syphilis study, that occurred over multiple generations in this country that was looking at what happens when penicillin is not given to individuals that are suffering with syphilis. And you will also see that that had a major impact on our research and our regulations. And you also would see for social behavioral, the Stanley Milgram study, Obedience to Authority, that had a major impact on why we have these protections in place.
We're just going to do a quick seat change.
And I'm turning it over to my colleague, Casey Webster.
Hi, everyone. This is Casey here. And Ross just talked about what an IRB is, why we have them, and what they do. So I just want to go over how IRBs do what they do. So IRBs, as Ross mentioned, have to review research involving human subjects for compliance with federal regulations and ethical codes. They also consider local issues and within the review process. And in order for research with human subjects to continue, IRBs have to approve that research. How do they do this? Well, in order to know whether they can approve a research protocol, the IRB has to know what the research actually is. So they ask investigators to submit research protocols. And what that is you outlining exactly how the research will go down. So the IRB knows everything that will happen. They do this through an IRB submission process. No two IRB submissions are the same. They'll vary even within institutions. But here are some of the typical submission requirements. I just want to go over them real quick for you. So they pretty much all require investigator information. And they call you, the researchers, principal investigators or research staff. And they want to know what your training is in research and in the protection of human subjects in research, and what your particular expertise are. The IRB is also going to want to know your funding source. They're going to want to know if it's federally funded for important reasons, as Ross pointed out, about whether even IRB review is required or not. And also some funders explicitly state certain review criteria. They want the actual research protocol, which pretty much should read like an instruction manual. The IRB should be able to pick up this research protocol and go through and perform the research. So it includes your study design, your methodology, and any research procedures. The IRB is going to want to look at participant information, so they want to know who is a participant, who you're recruiting, how you're recruiting them, and if you're compensating them in any way. The IRB is going to want to know what the risks are to the research and what the potential benefits are. This is really important because an IRB cannot approve a research protocol if the risks so outweigh the benefits. The IRB also want to know about privacy and confidentiality. So privacy applies to the person, your subjects, the way that your potential participants are identified and contacted, the actual research setting where research will take place. And then confidentiality applies to the data. So in your line of work, I know there's a lot of confidential data that is involved. So the IRB will want to know how you're maintaining that data and how you're going to access it, and if there are proper protections in place for that data. The IRB will also want to know what the consent process is like, and this is the process for which the research studies explain to participants. And this is also the process where participants can ask the researchers questions. And this is also when they agree to participate in the research or not. Like I said, it's a process. It's not a form that investigators have participants sign. It is an ongoing talk or discussion with participants. The IRB will also want to know if there's any conflicts of interest, and they also want to know that you as researchers are going to fulfill your obligations to protect the human subjects. Ross mentioned HIPAA earlier, and I just want to talk about it a tiny bit just to address it. And if you don't learn anything at all from this slide, I just want you to learn how to spell HIPAA, because it's always spelled incorrectly. So there's two A's. So HIPAA applies to covered entities. What is a covered entity? They're health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, or healthcare providers that electronically transmit health information. HIPAA also only applies to protected health information. And protected health information is individually identifiable health information.
Yes.
So the HIPAA privacy rule established conditions under which PHI could be used for research purposes. And in order to do that, researchers have to either obtain individual authorization from the individuals whom the data they're taking data from. They need to be using the research for information for preparatory research, so to prepare for research, or they could have approval from an IRB or a privacy board to waive authorization. In this instance, the IRB would say that you do not, as a researcher, do not have to obtain permission from the individual to use their PHI for your research. Or there's this thing called a limited data set, which is health information given to you as a researcher with certain identifiers removed so that it no longer technically meets the PHI definition. So there's various IRB review categories, and I'm just going to go over them real quickly. Student classroom projects really only has to do with educational institutions, not human subject research. So Ross took good time going over what the definition of research was and what the definition of human subject was. However, some institutions don't allow their researchers to make that determination themselves. They may require the IRB to make the determination or someone within the office. So sometimes there's a form for that. Another IRB review category is exemption. So this is a explicit category. There's actually 7 of them that were created under the common rule. And if your research falls into that category, then the project is technically exempt from IRB review. It doesn't mean it doesn't get any review. It just means that it doesn't have to go to an IRB member for review. Expedited, again, is some categories that were listed in the common rule. If your project fits within one of those categories, it is reviewed by a single IRB member. Some institutions may choose to have it reviewed by more than one, but it doesn't need to be reviewed by the entire IRB. Ones that do have to be reviewed by the entire IRB are called full board reviews. I just want to talk about what IRB members are looking at when they're reviewing research protocols. So they want to make sure that risks are minimized. They want to make sure that the procedures that are used are consistent with sound research design. They want to make sure that the procedures don't involve unnecessary risk. And they also want to make sure that the risks to subjects are reasonable in relation to the benefit. So there's that risk-benefit ratio I mentioned earlier. They don't typically consider possible long-range effects of applying knowledge gained in the research when it comes to benefits. So something important to consider. They want to make sure there's an equitable selection of subjects. So the IRB, in order to do this, takes into account the purpose of the research, the setting, and any vulnerable populations. I mentioned the informed consent process earlier, and the IRB will want to make sure that informed consent is obtained. So this is actually documenting the informed consent process. And the IRB actually could approve a waiver of the consent process or a waiver of documentation of consent in certain circumstances. The IRB will also make sure that privacy and confidentiality is protected. We talked about those earlier. And that there are additional safeguards in place for any vulnerable population. So I wanted to touch on vulnerable populations because a lot of you work or potentially do work with vulnerable populations. And they're actually specified by the common rule that was mentioned earlier. So these are the 4 populations that are specified by the common rule: fetuses, pregnant women, prisoners, and children. And we can see why they are listed, because they all are likely to be vulnerable to coercion or undue influence. There's also vulnerable populations that aren't specified, and those vary by institution about how the IRB handles research protocols involving those populations. But for example, they could be students or employees, cognitively impaired persons, terminally ill subjects, or people with AIDS, HIV. The big question is, the inclusion of the vulnerable population adequately justified, and are there safeguards in place to minimize the risks?
Okay, this is George. I'm going to jump in here because Casey's explained the process by which a set of research protocols gets to an IRB. So I'm going to make the assumption here that an IRB protocol has been approved. There are some protocols that are not approved by an IRB, but you'll find across IRBs that IRBs are generally very willing to work with a researcher. There might be a back and forth process by which an IRB might suggest alterations to research design because the risks have outweighed the benefits and so on and so forth. But for the moment, I'm going to assume that a protocol has been approved, and I'm going to take you through a couple of steps that a researcher will want to keep in mind once their protocol has been approved. Some of these are pretty obvious, like the first one, that the study is done within the study period, and you're not still doing the research after the study period has come to an end. Because if the study is for 1 year, the IRB is going to think, all right, at the end of a year, at the end of, say, December, they're going to think, all right, this project's done. And if they find out that you've been doing research beyond that period without seeking an extension, there could be some kind of consequence for that. So you'll want to make sure that you're doing it within the study period or seeking some kind of extension. You want to obviously do the research in a way that's spelled out in your protocols and stick to it. This third point is especially important, is to inform the IRB at once if there's been any adverse research event, such as, for example, the data, the computer that you have been storing your data on has been lost, and you have some confidential information on that, and in the wrong hands, maybe that information could be used in a way that would injure, so to speak, the people who are being studied. Here's some other things. If you want to do, this happens to me fairly frequently in my research. I get halfway into it, say 6 months into a year-long study, and the organization that I'm working with wants to do something a little different. That's fine, as long as you submit some kind of revisions to your protocol. That's not a terribly onerous process. It just requires letting the IRB know, and the IRB reviewing those changes and saying, yeah, they meet our approval. If there are any conditions in your protocols regarding the protection of information, such as where data is stored, you want to definitely conform to that practice. For example, I have some projects that have been approved by this IRB where I have to store data on a password-protected drive, computer drive here at the university, because they don't want all sorts of people having access to those data. Moving on to item number 6. What our IRB does a great job of is notifying me 60 days in advance of a project coming to an end that, your protocol is due to expire in 60 days. Are you going to need to seek some kind of extension? Now, not all IRBs do that, so you'll definitely want to make sure that you're staying on top of that. And one of the things that our IRB does, and I think this is pretty standard across the industry, is that once the project comes to a completion, you submit some kind of final report. Now, that's not necessarily like a long report. Typically, the IRB here at the University of Southern Maine requires like a page report. And, to be honest with you, what I often do is I'll take elements of, if I've done some kind of report that includes an executive summary, I'll take elements of that executive summary and put it into like a final report, and it just gives the IRB a record of what happened during that research. So I'm going to move on here to what happens in the event of a problem. And, you know, as an IRB member and as a researcher, I have encountered both. I have had to be called into the IRB at one point because I committed a research violation. That happened to me actually not too long ago, actually, full disclosure. And this was not something that I had a direct hand in, but someone was submitting data to me, and I had set up a protocol by which they submit those data to me on a protected server. They sent it to me via email, and that had some information in it that should not have gone through email because that creates a kind of a trace to that could conceivably be found by, you know, people who had more time on their hands than they need to. So I had to immediately file what's called a breach and, you know, let the IRB know that that there had been this, you know, this breach. Now, sometimes if the information that is breached, and I'm referencing number 3 here on this slide here, is that sometimes if there had been a breach with names included, you would have to notify the study participants to let them know that the information that we thought was going to be, was going to be kept in a confidential manner was released, and so that they know about it, and that you have to let them know that you're taking all sorts of steps to ensure that any injury to them is being minimized. So moving along here, you know, here are some possible remedies to problems that sometimes come up with research protocols. You know, sometimes one of the things that Casey outlined is that an IRB will want to know who's included and excluded from the study. Sometimes unanticipated problems will require you to change those criteria. Maybe there are other steps that you have to take to monitor additional procedures for monitoring the people that you're studying. In some cases, an IRB will suggest to you that you suspend enrollment of new subjects. We don't see a lot of that here at our university, but sometimes if you are working with, if you were to work with an IRB that is at a medical institution that is testing some kind of new drug, they might say, well, there are some unanticipated consequences of that new medication, and so the IRB of record will say, we will no longer allow new subjects to be enrolled. And here are some other possible remedies that can happen. Sometimes we have to modify informed consent forms, and we have to request additional information about newly recognized risks to subjects. So one of the things I just want to kind of, in the last couple of slides here, one of the things I wanted to touch upon was what you should consider when choosing an IRB. One of the things that is really important, I think, and I've gone to IRB conferences. You might be thinking, why would you do that? But they're actually really interesting, is you want an IRB that's really responsive. So if I submit a protocol, and say, I'll pick on my colleague here, Casey, I want to know that that's going to be acted upon fairly quickly because I want to get my research going. I don't want to wait several weeks because often, you know, the work that I'm doing has a pretty short duration, and so I don't want to waste a lot of time or you know, just kind of sitting around waiting for my set of protocols to get reviewed. So there's, like, to me, one of the big issues is the timeliness as well. So if I submit something, I want to know, like, within a few days, Casey's going to get back to me with a response, whether it be to approve it or whether I need to make further modifications to my protocol or better explain some of my protocols. That's, I think, one of the things that, I have to say with our IRB is that we're looking to always kind of minimize our turnaround time so that researchers here at our university kind of view us as an ally in this research process and not as a roadblock. So definitely look at, ask an IRB, if you're shopping around for an IRB, ask them if they have a turnaround time on IRB protocols. Obviously, cost is an important consideration. Different protocols are going to require a different cost. A full board review will cost more than an exempt review because a full board review will take more staff time and the time of the IRB itself. Reputation, like anything, is important. Expertise, if you are looking around for an IRB, you'll want, especially in our field, you want to know if they have people on the IRB who are familiar with the justice field, whether it be corrections population, law enforcement, courts. Definitely ask about that. And then, finally, just kind of generically, is it convenient, or am I going to have to, wait? In terms of convenience, is the IRB nearby? If it's not, can they get information back to me in a prompt manner through email or through phone? So definitely think about those things when you're picking an IRB. Moving up one of the things with the approval process is when you're submitting for an IRB to IRB protocols, definitely follow the instructions. One of the things that we've noticed here at the university is that, Casey and Ross have done a great job of spelling out what's needed. Casey had a slide earlier that said, these are the things that you'll need for your protocol submission. Definitely follow those, because that's one of the things, if there's guesswork on the part of the IRB, it's probably in the first round not going to be approved. It'll go back for further questionings. So if you do get questions, answer them completely, and as you don't have to, I typically will get, on a number of my protocols, questions seeking clarification. It doesn't require a long discourse. It just, requires a couple of concise sentences in responding to those questions. Just some other things. Our IRB, asks for attachments, including CVs, consent forms, surveys. If you are doing a survey here at the university, we'll want to see the instrument itself, so that we want to get an idea of how the questions are being asked, and just to kind of see if they're asking for the information being asked is it too personal? Could you get by with questions that are not as probing? And then, again, responding to IRB questions promptly. So that's IRB 101 in a nutshell. We'd be happy at this point to take questions. I know that that's been a whirlwind of information, but that gives you a kind of an overview. Here's a question. Who gives consent for a fetus? So who wants to take that one? Casey, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so that actually depends on the risk level of the research. So either just the mother or both parents actually may be required to give consent. So it's not really consent, it's permission, really. Does that answer the question, I hope?
Yeah. Other questions? Oh.
So, I can't read it, sorry. Next question is most of the IRB communication taking place in writing or in person? Do you actually meet with the board?
Oh, that's a great question. So the answer to that is both, I'll just take me as an example. Like when I submit protocols, and I probably submit 5 or 6 protocols a year, the first communication I'll get is like an acknowledgement that the protocols were received, which is really helpful because you want to know that, you know, we do an online submission for our research protocols. Not all IRBs do that, but we do that here at the university. That allows us to manage the protocols a lot more efficiently. So what will typically happen, like with my protocols, is I'll have one person on our IRB who I do not know, even though they are my fellow IRB members, will review it, and if they have any questions, will submit questions to me electronically that I will then go into our IRB software, if you will, and respond to them. Now, sometimes the IRB will ask the researcher to come in and further explain their research protocols, and we typically have like 2 or 3 of these a year, maybe, you know, where we'll say, well, and maybe we've done that because we've got some concerns about the research methods, and they haven't been able to sufficiently answer our initial questions, so that we will invite them to our monthly IRB meetings. And as I just kind of mentioned, our IRB meets as a full board once a month. Typically, we do more than just review protocols. We'll look at the protocols that have been approved across the university, and we'll also kind of engage in some continuing education, as well as looking at our response time on protocols. So here's another question. Did all agencies adopt subparts C and D that protect vulnerable populations? I don't think Justice adopted these subparts.
Right, so that's a great point. Not all the agencies have adopted the subparts. So the common rule itself is excludes those vulnerable populations that I mentioned, the fetuses, the pregnant women, the children, and the prisoners. So that's a great point. And I believe you're right that Justice Department did not adopt all of those. That being said, many IRBs will still consider those a vulnerable population, and they may not require you to take certain actions, but they'll be considerate of that.
Next question from Lisa Sampson here. Where do you look for the IRB? Is there an IRB clearinghouse? Do most universities provide this information on their website? So, I mean, many research universities have an IRB. Not all of them do. Like right now here in Maine, we have 7 universities, or 7 campuses that make up the UMaine system. There are, of the 7, there are 2 campuses that have IRBs, the University of Maine at Orono, which is the largest of the 7 campuses, and the University of Southern Maine, where Ross Casey and I are located. But in terms of a clearinghouse,
so there are different ways you could figure that out. So I talked about earlier the federal-wide assurance number that you would receive, and also that linked to that would be a IRB of record that would have to have its own registration. So you can go on, that's all publicly available information, and you could see through that, through the Office of Human Research Protection at the federal level. They store all of that information, so you could see who has a federal assurance and who has an IRB that is allowed to review federally funded projects, and that would be a good place to look. Not all institutions are going to do external reviews.
Yeah.
Many of them don't want to do those reviews for anyone but their own institution. There are some that have chosen to allow that. For example, our university does do external reviews for other institutions, and they don't, or individual researchers, and they don't have to be located in the state of Maine. But there are other places that would say only projects affiliated with our institution. You'll also see that if you're going to have an institution review it for you on your behalf, they likely are going to charge you some sort of money to either allow them to offset the expense, or if it's a for-profit, this is what they do. This is how they make their money.
Yeah.
And those sites, if you do a Google search, you'll find very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thing I'll just point out is that there are some liberal arts colleges or undergraduate institutions that do have IRBs. I think one of the things that I would just kind of caution folks about is that, you know, you want an IRB that has some expertise in the field of justice policy. Some colleges don't have that, whereas a university is more likely to have that expertise. Let's see. Here's another question. So we are not sure if we will be able to be heard. We will see. I don't know what that means. The other thing is, I want to kind of pick up on something else that Ross said, is that, you know, our IRB does do external reviews. We've actually done some reviews for the Ohio and Colorado SAC. So we do some other work beyond outside our state, and you'll see, you know, if you shop around for IRBs, is that, you know, some universities will do that, is they'll, you know, look outside their state. We, you know, did it for a couple of reasons here. One is that we wanted to kind of increase our capacity, and we thought that was an exciting opportunity to kind of get involved in reviewing research going on in other states. So here's another question. How do you know which is the right IRB, and right in quotations, IRB to use? For example, if you have access to an IRB through both a major university and an institution, e.g. a state agency, is there a reason to believe that one is better than the other?
Yes. You never underestimate, and George has already talked about this, word of mouth. Having the access to folks who've had the experience of using those institutions or those review boards is helpful. And also looking at the research portfolio of that institution and seeing if they have significant research projects coming through that align with what you need reviewed. But there's other things as well in the industry. Looking at the support unit behind your IRB. So being able to look at how robust or how many folks are in the support staff for the IRB, and what are the credentials of those folks. For example, in the field of human subject protection, there's what's called a CIP, or a Certified IRB Professional. If you have someone on the website that looks to be connected to supporting that IRB who has that credential, that should be a good indication of a few things. One, their expertise, but also that institution's placing of importance on their human research protection program. Another thing you can look at, and I am not connected to them in any way, I should say that I'm on the CIP council for Primer, so I will disclose that. But for AHARP, that's an accredited agency. If you see AHARP accreditation, they've gone through a very formal review process. That's another indicator that there's significant resources dedicated to that program at that institution.
The other thing that I'll just jump in on with the reference to the state agency is that some, you know, like being here in Maine, I work with a number of state agencies. We do a lot of work with our health department here in Maine and that's referred to as the Maine Centers for Disease Control. They used to have an IRB. Now they weren't meeting enough. They were meeting every 3 or 4 months. So because they didn't have a big research portfolio, and a couple of years ago they approached us to kind of become the IRB of record for them. So one of the things, if you're looking at a state agency, is to see, as a possible, you know, if they have an IRB, and if you're possibly thinking about working with them, is do they meet frequently enough to be, you know, to help you? We've got another question that's come in here. This one's a little
while you guys are reading that, I'll just wanted to add this on very quickly. George makes a really good point, because what you'll tend to see out in the field is that if the IRB is not reviewing many projects, the tendency there is to overestimate risk, which means that they're going to elevate the review level that Casey talked about, and it's going to be a longer turnaround time. So that's why you want to find people that are not overwhelmed and have capacity to review, but actually see frequently enough projects so that they're pretty sharp on what the review requirements are.
All right. So this is a long question.
So I think this question is asking whether the project is research with human subjects or not.
Should I read the question? I don't know if everyone has seen it. So if working with a community that requested assistance in reducing a criminal justice issue, the community stakeholders are engaging focus groups interviews with the community to identify personal opinions or observations of the criminal justice issue in the community. Is an IRB approval necessary if you're using the community members' opinion to identify strategies to mitigate the criminal justice issue? I would say yes on this one.
Well, the first two, if we go back to those definitions, you have an individual that is engaged in an interaction. You're interacting with them through the focus groups, for example, or interviews. You are asking them information that is their personal opinion.
That's right.
A personal opinion is about themselves. It's not information that is just simply factual. It is their personal opinion. So you have the first prong in that you have human subjects. The question then is it research? Now, is it research? You have a systematic investigation, which we talked about. But do you have a design, and it's designed in a way to produce information or share information, but is it generalizable? Is it information that can be extrapolated more broadly than that community? And that's where you're going to run into, I think, the question of whether or not it is human subject research. Is there a generalizable component of it? And if there is, then you would want to err on the side of having an IRB look at it. Again, given the type of work that is, it should not necessarily be a very high review level, unless there's something we're missing in the questions.
Yeah. The other thing about that is, even if it's not, one of the things that you want to make sure of is how that data is being collected and captured. So, for example, if you are recording that focus group and names are being used in transcripts that are being produced as a result of that recording, then that's possibly a higher risk. So because maybe someone has given a personal opinion that is critical of someone, and if that information was to be divulged, it might be injurious to that person. So, for example, maybe you made a critical remark about the Department of Corrections commissioner, you know, or their practices, or one of your focus group participants did. And even though it's not generalizable, as Ross was saying, you'll want to have some safeguards in there, you know, in your protocols, right, to protect the individual.
This is where it can get very tricky in social behavior research, because publication does not necessarily mean generalizability. And I'm sure that this information is going to be publicized, which means you may need colleagues to look at it and help you with maintaining its confidentiality, as George said. And if you have an office like ours, we're happy to look and give you advice. But to go back to the importance, IRBs usually will want to be very careful that they are not claiming oversight over projects that they are not considered human subject research. The other thing is, if you go to publish in a journal, I'll bring that up again. If they're telling you it's human subject research, or the funding source tells you that it should go through an IRB, then that's not a hill to die on. You should probably go through an IRB. Even if there's an academic argument to why it shouldn't, you'll find that many times, because they want that protection that George says, your funding source will say, we think it needs to go through an IRB, and my advice to you is that you probably then want to do that.
Yeah. And I think the important, you know, just the final takeaway on that is that, you know, again, you know, one of the things that when I was starting out as a researcher so many years ago, you know, the thought of submitting something to an IRB just kind of made me cringe a little bit, because I thought it would be a long and laborious process. I now know that it isn't that way, especially as the field has really become more professionalized, and you know, the turnaround for, you know, I now know what I need to include in my protocols, and I know, like our university, and I think other universities are similar this way, is that I can expect a prompt turnaround. So just think about that, and you know, an IRB is not a four-letter word. So, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, and we're past our hour. I don't know if anything else, Bailey or Jason. I'll turn it back back to you. If you have any further questions about IRBs, please email me, G. Shaler, that's GSHALER @Maine, that's the state.edu. So I'd be happy to get back with you on any of that. So Bailey, I'll kick it back to you.
Hi, this is Stan Orchowski. Can anybody hear me?
Okay, Stan, I'm sorry.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. We really appreciate the information. As George said, if you have questions for him, feel free to email him or email JRSA, and we'll be happy to just forward those on. We're going to go ahead and launch some polls. We would appreciate your taking a few minutes to fill this out to get feedback on today's webinar. And just want to remind you that if you didn't have a chance at the beginning of the webinar and you were listening or viewing as a group, if you could please go to the chat window and type in the name of the person who registered today.
Dan, we're kind of losing you a little bit here.
Okay. The number of people who if you didn't get a chance and you're with a group, go to the chat window, tell us who registered and how many people were listening. And the poll is up now, so if you could please take a few minutes to fill that out and look for upcoming webinars in the upcoming weeks and months. Thank you all.